Moving on to today's committee hearing, Oversight Democrats have called a hearing on enhanced work perks for federal bureaucrats. That's right. More benefits for federal employees who already enjoy job security and lavish set of benefits not afforded to most American workers. This follows the Biden administration's recent announcement delaying the federal workforce's return to the workplace, despite most Americans being expected to show up for work. Meanwhile, hardworking Americans across the country are still recovering from the economic impacts of Democrat lockdowns, and our nation is facing many crises due to President Biden's disastrous policies. The Oversight Committee's time would be better spent focused on our committee's mission of identifying and preventing government waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement, and ensuring the government is transparent and accountable to the American people. Unlike Democrats, Republicans have been focused on fulfilling our committee's mission. On February 11th, 133 days ago, Republicans called for a hearing on massive unemployment fraud in California, where benefits were sent to murderers on death row, deceased individuals, and organized crime members in China and Russia. Chairwoman Maloney refused to hold a hearing on this gross mismanagement of taxpayer dollars. And now it's reported that $400 billion in pandemic assistance unemployment benefits were stolen, with as much as half the funds going to international crime organizations. Last week, Republicans called for a hearing on the heist of the century, but the chairwoman has not responded, unfortunately, to our hearing request. On February 24th, 124 days ago, Republicans called on Chairwoman Maloney to compel New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to testify under oath regarding his deadly order sending COVID positive patients to nursing homes and his subsequent cover-up. This is a gross abuse of power, and Governor Cuomo must be held accountable for his actions that resulted in the death of thousands of senior citizens. But have Democrats subpoenaed Governor Cuomo, let alone called a hearing on this issue? No. On February 25th, 123 days ago, Republicans called for a hearing on reopening America's schools. Ongoing virtual school has harmed students' well-being. Failing grades, mental health issues, and suicides are up across the board. Since we called for a hearing, we've learned that President Biden's CDC allowed a radical teachers union to interfere in its scientific guidance, effectively recommending 90% of schools remain shuttered. Now that the school year has ended and only about half of public schools finished up the school year fully in person, have Democrats held a hearing on this pressing issue, which threatens to set back a generation of kids? No. On March 4th, 112 days ago, Republicans called on Democrats to hold a hearing on President Biden's border crisis. We renewed our request 2 additional times since then. Since President Biden assumed office, masses of children have been held in overcrowded facilities during a pandemic and past the legal time frame. Apprehensions at the southwest border are at a 21-year high. The human smuggling industry is booming, and deadly drugs like fentanyl are pouring across our border. This is the very definition of government mismanagement and is ripe for congressional oversight. The Democrats held multiple hearings on conditions at the border and conducted several site visits to border facilities during the Trump administration. But now that a Democrat occupies the White House, crickets, nothing. On April 26, 59 days ago, Republicans called for a hearing on Mayor Bowser's solitary confinement of DC inmates. Under the excuse of pandemic precautions, inmates essentially have been held in universal solitary confinement as they are confined to their cells for 23 hours a day. This has resulted in severe effects on the inmates, including many sleeping at odd hours of the day, talking to themselves, others growing extensive beards and hair because the barbershops closed. This government abuse should be investigated, especially since it's happening in the district, which is under this committee's jurisdiction. But Democrats have failed to address this issue. On May 24th, Republicans called for an investigation into the Wuhan lab leak. There is evidence Communist China started the pandemic, covered it up, and is responsible for the deaths of almost 600,000 Americans and millions more worldwide. These questions are not a diversion, as Speaker Pelosi has stated. They get to the truth and accountability. And what is the Democrats' response? They're too busy investigating the Trump administration to have time to determine the origination of the COVID pandemic. And last week, Republicans called for a hearing on the massive leak of sensitive taxpayer information from the IRS. This committee has a history of conducting strong oversight over government officials at the IRS who abuse their position for political gain while thwarting congressional accountability and oversight. This committee must convene a hearing with Biden administration officials to understand who is responsible for these leaks of sensitive tax information. We must also determine what effects, if any, the administration has taken to prevent this from ever happening again. We are awaiting a response from the distinguished chairwoman. Madam Chair, it's past time for this committee to get back to its primary mission. We've already dramatically expanded paid leave for the federal workforce. Today's hearing to consider expanded paid leave even further for federal workers shows Democrats' priorities are incredibly distorted. The American people are concerned about the ongoing border crisis, abuses of power in government, getting their kids back to school, and the rising cost of goods and services, better known as inflation. We need to put the American people first, not the special interests of federal bureaucrats. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes herself to respond to my dear friend and colleague from the other side of the aisle. I doubt that the women in the great state of Kentucky think that having a child is a, quote, perk. It is not a perk. And too many of us have been fired, thrown out of the room, told not to come back because you dared to have a child. Many women have sick children, and when they're sick, they need their mother. If your child is traumatized, if your child is sick, what's wrong with giving them paid leave to be there, to be with them? We both know that most women have to work. Most women have to work. Most families depend on two incomes. They can't make it on one income. I have federal employees call me asking, when is the bill going to pass so I can have a child? They can't even afford to have a child to take because they're going to be fired. They're not going to be paid when they're out with their child, and they need to be with their child in those critical first weeks of life. This is not a perk we're talking about. My brother was in Vietnam. When he was deployed, it was traumatic to his family. They would have liked to have been with him. They would have liked the time to adjust with 3 small children, but he was sent into the war zone. So, I mean, deployment of our military is serious business. It's not a perk. It's a crisis in most families. And what we're talking about is balanced policies that I will say that most countries in the world already have, even third world countries. We're the greatest country in the world. Can't we respect our workers? And I would like to respond to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that are always very protective of the private sector, and I am too. They're very important. They pay all the taxes for this country. But the private sector is far ahead of the public sector and how they treat their employees. They have in-building daycare centers. They have birthing, they have milking centers, they have support, they have paid leave, they have, working from your home leave. They have all of these things that the federal government does not have. And let me tell you, when I had my first child and went to personnel to talk about leave, they said, leave, we just want you to leave. I said, I don't want to leave. They said, you will be the first person in the history of this establishment that has had a baby and come back. I said, I am coming back. They said, well, you can apply for disability. I said, having a child is not a disability. It is a joy. It is a family value. It is something we should celebrate, not punish women for. We should celebrate them, give them the support that they so justly deserve in our society. We talk about family values. Where are they? My whole life, I have fought for balance between work and family because I suffered it in my own family. Only recently Are people seriously talking about it? When President Biden announced it, I felt like I'd died and gone to heaven. That all of these issues that I had cared about, work-family balance, were being talked about seriously by the President of the United States. It is our job to try to implement them. And that is what we are doing today. And if you do a study comparing the private sector to the public sector, the private sector is doing a much better job in adjusting and really doing work-family balance within their companies. Most of them have paid leave. Most of them have on-campus daycare. Most of them have all kinds of services for their employees, and the federal government needs to keep pace. We know that we can't pay the same salary as the private sector. We know that. We have to find people that are committed to public service, but we also have to help them balance their families with the work that they have. I now recognize that.
Madam Chair, with all due respect,